I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years, and the last three reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire, and the pound, the rise and early decline of the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies. I also studied the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts to understand China's patterns better. I studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their currencies all the way back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the four most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form of it. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So, how am I measuring an empire's power in this study? I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness, and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they are rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires, and because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause and effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict. Often a war establishes the new leading power in the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns. External conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again. Now let me break this down in more detail, because understanding this pattern is crucial to understanding where we are today and where we're likely headed. The Dutch Empire rose to dominance. In the 1600s, they were the first to really master global trade and finance. Amsterdam became the financial center of the world. Dutch ships dominated the seas carrying goods from Asia to Europe. They invented the modern stock market, the joint stock company, and sophisticated financial instruments. The Dutch guilder became the reserve currency of the time, meaning international trade was conducted in guilders, and countries held guilders in their reserves. This gave the Dutch enormous power because they could print money that others wanted to hold. But here's what happened. Success led to complacency. The Dutch got rich and comfortable. They started borrowing heavily to finance their lifestyle. They had a massive tulip bubble in the 1630s where tulip bulb prices went insane before crashing. Sound familiar? They also faced increasing competition from the British, who were investing heavily in their navy and building their own trading empire. The Dutch fought several wars with the British and eventually lost their dominance by the early 1700s. The British were rising and the Dutch were declining. The guilder lost its status as the reserve currency, and the pound sterling took over. The British Empire followed a similar pattern. They invested heavily in education. They led the Industrial Revolution with innovations in manufacturing, steam power, and railways. They built the world's most powerful navy. They established colonies and trading posts all over the world. London became the global financial center, replacing Amsterdam. The pound sterling became the world's reserve currency. Britain controlled a quarter of the world's land and population at its peak. They were the undisputed superpower of the 1800s, but again success planted the seeds of decline. Britain's wealth gap grew. The rich got richer while workers in factories lived in terrible conditions. This led to social unrest and eventually reforms. Britain also took on massive debts to finance its empire and fight wars. World War I was the breaking point. The war was incredibly expensive. Britain had to borrow heavily from the United States. After the war, Britain was exhausted and deeply in debt. The U.S. had become the world's largest economy and creditor. The transition of power from Britain to the U.S. took place roughly between 1900 and 1950. There were 2 world wars during this transition period, which is typical. The declining power doesn't give up easily. The United States followed the same playbook. After World War II, the U.S. was the clear winner. Most of Europe and Asia were destroyed. The U.S. had the only major economy that was intact and growing. The U.S. established the New World Order at Bretton Woods in 1944. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, replacing the pound. The U.S. built the most powerful military, created the best universities, led in technology and innovation, dominated global trade, and New York became the world's financial center. American culture spread everywhere. For about 25 years after World War II, the U.S. was overwhelmingly dominant. This was the peak. But then the pattern repeated. The U.S. got into expensive wars in Vietnam and elsewhere. Domestic inequality grew. The civil rights movement and social unrest in the 1960s. The U.S. started running trade deficits and printing money. Nixon had to abandon the gold standard in 1971 because the U.S. didn't have enough gold to back all the dollars it had printed. The 1970s were rough with inflation and economic stagnation. The U.S. recovered somewhat in the 1980s and 1990s, the tech boom, defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but the 2000s brought new problems, expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, massive money printing, growing wealth inequality, political polarization, and now a rising challenger in China. China's story is fascinating because they have been through this cycle multiple times. Over thousands of years, China was the world's largest economy for much of history. They invented paper money, gunpowder, printing, the compass. They had massive trade networks. But they also went through repeated cycles of rise and decline. Dynasties would rise, become powerful and prosperous, then decline due to internal corruption, inequality, and external invasions. The Mongols conquered China, then the Ming Dynasty rose and built the Great Wall, then the Qing Dynasty, then decline and humiliation by European powers in the 1800s, civil war, Japanese invasion, communist revolution. But since 1980, China has been on an incredible rise. They started with economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping, opened up to trade and foreign investment, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, massive infrastructure development, huge investments in education, now leading in many technologies, building a powerful military, the Belt and Road Initiative to expand trade networks. The yuan is starting to be used more in international trade, challenging the dollar. China is following the same pattern that the Dutch, British, and Americans followed. So here's the key question. Where are we in the cycle right now? The US is clearly past its peak. You can see it in almost every metric. Education is no longer the best in the world. Innovation is still strong, but facing more competition. Trade deficits have been running for decades. The dollar is still the reserve currency, but its dominance is slowly declining. Military is still the strongest, but stretched thin. Wealth inequality is back to levels not seen since the 1920s. Political system is completely dysfunctional with extreme polarization, massive debts at every level, government, corporate, household, and the solution every time is to print more money. Meanwhile, China is rising. They're not there yet, but they're on the trajectory. They have some advantages, a long-term planning horizon, massive investments in infrastructure and technology, a huge population, growing middle class, but they also have problems. An aging population, a lot of debt, political repression that might stifle innovation, potential conflicts with neighbors. The big question is whether they can continue rising or if they'll hit obstacles. And the other big question is, how will the US react? Will there be a peaceful transition or a violent one? History suggests transitions are rarely peaceful. Let me give you more detail on why this pattern keeps repeating. It comes down to human nature and basic economics. When a country is rising, the people are hungry, they work hard, they invest in the future, they're innovative, they're unified against external threats, but success changes everything. The next generation grows up with wealth they didn't have to fight for. They get complacent, they focus on consuming rather than producing. They borrow against the future, the elite, capture more of the wealth, and use their power to rig the system in their favor. This creates inequality and resentment. The country takes on debt to maintain living standards and fight wars to maintain dominance. Eventually, the debt becomes unsustainable. And here's the thing about reserve currencies. Having the reserve currency is an enormous advantage. You can print money and export your inflation to other countries. You can run trade deficits because others want to hold your currency. You can borrow cheaply, but this also becomes a trap. You start to abuse this privilege, you print too much, you borrow too much, you run bigger and bigger deficits. Eventually, others lose confidence. They start diversifying away from your currency, and when that happens, the game is over. You can't just print money anymore because no one wants it. You have to actually produce real value again, but you've lost the capacity to do that because you've been living off financial engineering for too long. This is where the US is right now, still the dominant power, still has the reserve currency, but clearly past peak and facing a rising challenger. The US national debt is over $35 trillion and growing. The government runs trillion-dollar deficits every year. The Federal Reserve responds to every crisis by printing money. Wealth inequality is extreme. The political system can't agree on anything. Infrastructure is crumbling. Education rankings have fallen. Health outcomes are worse than other developed countries despite spending more. Life expectancy is declining. Meanwhile, China has built incredible infrastructure, high-speed rail everywhere, modern cities, invested heavily in green energy, leads in electric vehicles, dominates manufacturing, growing technology sector. Now, I'm not saying China is going to definitely take over or that it's a better system. They have serious problems too. But the pattern is clear. The US is declining relatively, and China is rising. How this plays out will define the next few decades. If history is a guide, we should expect increasing conflict. This might be economic, trade wars, currency wars, technology competition, or it could escalate to actual military conflict. The transition from British to American dominance involved 2 world wars. The question is, can we transition from American to Chinese dominance, or a multipolar world without a major war, or are we doomed to repeat the pattern? Let me walk you through the stages in more detail. Stage 1 is the new order. After a major conflict, the winners established the rules. After World War II, the US created the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the dollar as reserve currency. This is the New World Order. Everyone agrees to play by these rules because the dominant power is so strong, no one can challenge it. Stage 2 is peace and prosperity because there's a clear dominant power and everyone follows the rules. There's relative peace, trade flourishes, the economy grows, people get rich. This happened in the US from 1945 to 1970. Incredible prosperity, the American dream was real. Stage 3 is the bubble. People get used to prosperity and assume it will continue forever. They borrow money to buy houses, stocks, whatever. asset prices go up. This creates a wealth effect where people feel richer and spend more. The economy grows even faster, but it's based on debt, not real productivity. In the US, this happened in different ways. The stock bubble in the 1920s, the tech bubble in the 1990s, the housing bubble in the 2000s. Each time the bubble bursts, it causes a crisis. Stage 4 is money printing and conflict. When the bubble burst, the government steps in to try to fix it by printing money and bailing out the system. This creates inflation or asset bubbles. It also increases inequality because the newly printed money goes to those who already have assets. The gap between rich and poor grows. This leads to political conflict. In the extreme, you get revolutions or civil wars. In milder cases, you get political polarization and dysfunction. The US is clearly in this stage right now. Massive money printing after 2008 and 2020. Extreme wealth inequality. Complete political polarization, stage 5, is the challenge. While the dominant power is dealing with internal conflict, a rising power emerges. This rival has been building strength, investing in their future, and now they're strong enough to challenge the existing order. They start demanding changes to the rules. They build up their military. They expand their influence. The US is facing this challenge from China right now. Stage 6 is the conflict. The declining power doesn't want to give up dominance. The rising power wants to change the rules in their favor. This leads to confrontation, economic warfare, technology competition, proxy wars, and potentially direct military conflict. We're in the early stages of this now with the US-China rivalry, trade wars, tech competition, Taiwan situation, South China Sea disputes. Stage 7 is the resolution. Eventually one side wins, or they reach a new accommodation. A new world order is established with new rules, new reserve currency, new dominant power or powers, and the cycle starts over. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, if you understand the pattern, you can prepare for what's coming. We're likely headed for a period of increasing conflict and instability, economic crises, political upheaval, possibly war. The dollar will likely lose its reserve currency status over the next few decades. This will be painful for Americans who have been living beyond their means. The standard of living will decline. There will be inflation or major depression or both. Politically, things will probably get worse before they get better. More polarization, more extremism, potential for serious civil unrest. But this isn't the end of the world. It's just the transition from one cycle to the next. America will still exist. It will still be a major power, but it won't be the dominant power anymore. We'll probably move to a multipolar world with several major powers, US, China, maybe India, maybe a unified Europe, and eventually a new dominant power will emerge and the cycle will start again. For individuals, the key is to understand what's happening. Diversify your assets. Don't be too concentrated in any one currency or country. Own real assets like property, businesses, commodities. Have skills that are valuable in any economy. Build networks and relationships. Be adaptable. The big lesson from studying these cycles is that nothing lasts forever. Every empire rises and falls. Every reserve currency eventually loses its status. Every dominant power is eventually challenged and overtaken. This isn't pessimism, it's just reality. Understanding this pattern doesn't mean you can prevent it, but you can prepare for it. You can protect yourself and your family. You can even profit from it if you see what's coming. The key is not to get caught up in the narratives that people tell themselves during the bubble phase. Oh, this time is different. We're different. We've learned from history. No, we're not different. The pattern repeats because human nature doesn't change. Greed, fear, ambition, the desire for power, these are constants. The technology changes, the names change, but the underlying dynamics are the same. The Dutch thought they were special. The British thought their empire would last forever. Americans think the dollar will always be the reserve currency. The Chinese will probably think the same thing when it's their turn, but the cycle always continues, rise and decline, over and over. Understanding this gives you perspective. It helps you see through the propaganda and narratives. It helps you make better decisions. So that's the big cycle, empires rise and fall in predictable patterns, driven by education, innovation, trade, reserve currency status, and then decline driven by debt, inequality, conflict, and the rise of a new challenger. We're watching this play out in real time right now with the US and China. It's going to be a wild ride over the next few decades. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts on where you think we are in the cycle and where we're headed. And subscribe because understanding these big picture patterns is crucial for navigating the chaos ahead. Thanks for watching.